Minute Math. When you need help, you use Minute Math.
Hi, I'm Sean Gannon, and this is Minute Math. And today we're going to learn about absolute value equations. We're going to solve each equation. So if I was given this equation, absolute value 6m equals 42. Okay, so the absolute value of 6m equals 42. Well, our first step here, and for a lot of these it's already done for us, is we need to isolate the absolute value, which we have. We've isolated the absolute value. It's all by itself here. Okay, so the absolute value is all by itself equals 42. Once that happens, we then can split this equation up into two parts. 6m, what's inside the absolute value, equal to the right a positive 42, and 6m equals a negative 42. And now we have to solve each part individually. So first step here, I'm going to see times 6 and divide by 6 to both sides. And we're left with m equals a positive 7. And here I'm going to divide by 6 to both sides as well. And I have m equals a negative 7. Okay? And so my answers here, I have two answers, is m equals a negative 7 and a positive 7. And there we go. We have two solutions that work for this equation. Right? Absolute value of negative 6x and absolute value equals 30. All right, our absolute value is isolated here. Fantastic. And so now I need to separate this equation into two different equations. Negative 6x equals a positive 30, and negative 6x equals a negative 30. Okay, we have positive 30 and a negative 30. We need to split this up so we have what's on the inside of the absolute value equals positive 30 and then also a negative 30. And now we need to solve. Well, solve each equation. I'm going to divide both sides by a negative 6, leaving me here with 30 divided by negative 6, which is a negative 5. Positive divided by negative is a positive. Divide by negative 6 here, and I have x equals, well, negative 30 divided by negative 6 is a positive 5. Be careful, okay, be careful. This one becomes a positive 5, and this one becomes a negative 5, okay? I'll see students who will just say, okay, this one's positive, this one is negative, and they don't understand why they didn't get their answer fully correct, because they messed up on their negatives here, right? So this one, negative divided by a negative is a positive, positive divided by a negative is a negative. So my final answer is x equals negative 5 and a positive 5. Absolute value of k minus 10 equals 3. So the absolute value of k minus 10 equals 3. Well, I need to isolate the absolute value. Already done. So now I can separate this into two equations. K minus 10 equals a positive 3, and k minus 10 equals a negative 3. We separate the absolute value equal to a positive and negative, whatever's on the right here. Okay? So k minus 10 equals positive 3, k minus 10 equals negative 3. Now I'm going to solve each equation individually. I'm going to add a 10 to both sides, leaving me with k equals a positive 13. And I'm going to add a 10 to both sides here, leaving me with k equals a positive 7. And so when I write my answers, I usually like to write in least to greatest. Okay? And so the two values that k can be in this equation are k equals 7 and 13. And that's our final answer. The absolute value of x over 7 equals 3. Okay? Well, the absolute value here is already isolated. Once that's isolated by itself on one side of the equation, I then need to separate this into two parts, two equations. I'm going to take the x over 7 and set it equal to a positive 3, and the x over 7 and set it equal to a negative 3. Okay? Now that they're separated, I'm going to solve each equation individually. I'm going to multiply both sides by 7 here. And I'm left with x equals a positive 21. And again, multiply both sides here by 7 in the right equation, leaving me with x equals a negative 21. Remember, the 7's here will cancel. And so when I write my final answer here, okay, I have x equals 21, x equals negative 21. I'm going to write from least to greatest. So I'm going to have x equals a negative 21 and a positive 21. And there we go. That's my final answer. Absolute value of 7 plus p equals good old 7. Well, first thing is I have to look and see, is the absolute value isolated? And it is. It's by itself on one side of the equation. So now I can split this into two problems. 7 plus p equals a positive 7. And 7 plus p was inside the absolute value equals a negative 7. We take what's number out here, make a positive and negative. And so now we can solve each one individually. So I'm going to subtract a 7 to both sides here, leaving me with just p equals 0, right? Because 7 minus 7 is 0. And here I subtracted 7 to both sides, but in this case here, p equals negative 7 minus 7 is negative 14. And so our final answer is p equals negative 14 and 0. Okay? And I write the smaller number first. Okay? The absolute value of negative 3p equals 15. So the absolute value of negative 3p equals 15. Well, once the absolute value is isolated by itself, I then can break it apart into two equations. We have the negative 3p equals positive 15. We take the positive 15. And negative 3p, what's inside the absolute value, equals, opposite of that, the negative 15. Okay? So negative 3p equals positive 15, and negative 3p equals a negative 15. I then solve each equation individually. I divide by 3 to both sides. P equals 15 divided by negative 3, which is a negative 5. Divide this side by negative 3 as well, leaving me with p equals negative 15 divided by negative 3 is a positive 5. And so my two answers are negative 5 and positive 5. So to write it in one nice statement, p equals lower number first, negative 5, comma, positive 5. And there we go. That's our final answer. 7 times the absolute value of n equals 56. Okay? 5 is really small, but it's okay. So 7 absolute value of n equals 56. Well, that's multiplication that's going on there, right? That's multiplication. Well, I can't separate this into two equations until the absolute value is by itself. So my first step here is actually dividing both sides by 7. What that allows me to have here is absolute value of n equals 56 divided by 7, which is 8. Now I can break this into two equations, right? What's inside the absolute value equals a positive 8 here. And then n equals, what's the absolute value? A negative 8. And so in this case, once we separated them into two equations, we were done. That was our final step. Okay? And so our final answer is n equals 8, n equals negative 8. I'm going to write it from least to greatest. So n equals negative 8, comma 8. And that is our final answer. The absolute value of m over 5 equals 3. Well, my first step is to try to get the absolute value isolated. So to do that, I have to multiply 5 to both sides. That leaves me with the absolute value of m here, and then 3 times 5 being 15. At that point, the absolute value is isolated. I can separate this into two equations. M equals, right? Well, positive 15, what number is there? And then negative 15, the opposite of that. So we have positive 15 and negative 15. At this point, we're done. M is already by itself. We have a number, and there's two of them. And so that's our final answer. We're going to write from least to greatest. So M equals a negative 15 and a positive 15. And there we go. Fairly simple, this one. Negative 3, absolute value of P, equals a negative 12. Okay? First step is to get the absolute value isolated. So to do that, I needed to divide by negative 3. That leaves us here with the absolute value of P by itself equals negative 12 divided by negative 3. A negative divided by a negative is a positive. We have a positive 4 here. So now I have the absolute value of P equals positive 4. I can break that now apart into two equations, leaving me P equals a positive 4, right? And P equals the opposite of that, a negative 4, right? That's part of the things. When we have absolute value isolated, we break the equation apart into two parts, two equations, and make it a positive and negative whatever number's there. So p equals positive 4, p equals negative 4. I can rearrange this, right, to go from least to greatest. So my final answer is p equals negative 4 and positive 4. There we go. Absolute value of m plus 2 equals 11. Okay. First step is to isolate the absolute value, so I have to subtract a 2 to both sides. That leaves me with the absolute value of m equals 11 minus 2, which is a positive 9. From there, since the absolute value is by itself, we can separate this into two equations. Absolute value of m turns into just m equals a positive 9, and here m equals a negative 9. We break it down to a negative and a positive. And then rewrite this from least to greatest because it looks nicer. And so my final answer is just m equals negative 9 and positive 9. Fairly simple problem, right? They're already by themselves, these numbers. So we can just say that's our final answer, m equals negative 9 and positive 9. Absolute value of n plus 1 equals 2. Well, first step, get absolute value by itself, subtract a 1 on both sides. Leaving me with the absolute value of n, fit tight there, equals 2 minus 1, which is 1. And I know that's going to annoy me. I'm sure it would annoy you too. Absolute value of n. There we go. Okay? So then, from there, once we have the absolute value isolated, we can break this apart into two equations. Absolute value of n turns into just n equals, well, I'll take that number and make it positive and negative, so positive 1, negative 1, leaving me with n equals 1, n equals negative 1. Well, at that point, we're pretty much done. N is already by itself, it equals two numbers, so we have n equals, least first, negative 1, greater positive 1. And there's our final answer. Over 7 equals 5. First step, get the absolute value by itself. So I multiply 7 to both sides, leaving me here with the absolute value. Oh my goodness, we're getting too small. Absolute value of x equals 5 times 7, 35. From there, the absolute value is already isolated. I can break this apart into two equations. X equals positive 35 and x equals a negative 35. Okay? Once the absolute value is isolated, we can break this apart into a positive and negative. From there, I'm basically done. I'm going to rewrite the lower number first. So we have x equals a negative 35 and positive 35. And that, folks, is my final answer. Equation. Absolute value of a minus, that's an a minus 5 over 8 equals 5. Okay? There's a few steps here. Well, first step is to isolate the absolute value. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 8. I cancel that here. Leave me with the absolute value of a minus 5 equals 5 times 8, which is 40. At this point, the absolute value is isolated. So now I can break this equation apart into two equations, eliminating the absolute value. So that leaves me with a minus 5 equals a positive 40, and a minus 5 equals a negative 40. Now I need to solve each equation individually. I add a 5 to both sides, leaving me with a equals 45, positive 45. Here I add a 5 to both sides, leaving me with a equals a negative 35. Negative 40 plus 5 is negative 35. So I have my two answers. I'm going to write them from least to greatest. So a equals negative 35, and a positive 45 is my final answer. 4 times n plus 8 in absolute value equals 56. Remember, that's multiplication right there, the 4 absolute value of n plus 8. And so opposite multiplication is division. Divide both sides by 4. I need to isolate that absolute value. 4 is eliminate, leaving me with absolute value of n plus 8 equals 56 divided by 4, which is 14. Now Now be careful. A lot of times students will just get rid of the absolute value here. Not yet. That's the next step, right? So when they divide it, like, oh, I don't need it anymore, they just get rid of it. No. Now, our next step gets rid of the absolute value by breaking this apart into two equations, right? The absolute value is isolated, so now we can separate this out. So we're left with n plus 8 equals positive 14, and n plus 8 equals a negative 14, okay? So now I have to solve each equation individually. I subtract from 8 to both sides, leaving me with n by itself here, 14 minus 8 being 6, and then negative 14 minus 8 is a more negative number, and n, so n equals negative 14 minus 8, which is a negative 22, and so our final answer is n equals negative 22 and positive 6. We write from least to greatest because that's nice and neater. Absolute value of 7m plus 3 equals 73. Okay? Well, my first step, I need to isolate the absolute value. So I have to subtract a 3 to both sides. That leaves me with the absolute value of 7m on the left, isolated, important, equals 73 minus 3, which is 70. Okay? Now my next step is I need to, I can now get rid of the absolute value, but break this apart into two equations. So we have 7m equals 70, and 7m equals a negative 70. When you break it apart, you make it into a positive and negative. From there, I then solve each equation individually, and they're both the same step of dividing by 7 to both sides of the equation, leaving me with, well, m by itself equals 10. 70 divided by 7, which is a 10. Come on, Sean. And m equals here, negative 70 divided by positive 7. Negative divided by positive is negative, so we have negative 10. And so my two answers, to make it look nice and neat here, is negative 10, lower number first, and positive 10. And there we go. Absolute value of x over 7 minus 8 equals a negative 7. First step, isolate the absolute value. I'm going to add an 8 to both sides. In doing so, I'm left with the absolute value of x over 7 equals negative 7 plus 8, which is a positive 1. From there, since the absolute value is isolated, I can break this apart into two equations, leaving me with x over 7 equals a positive 1 and x over 7 equals a negative 1. I can't read it once. You'd think it wouldn't be so complicated as being a straight line. Well, x over 7 equals positive 1, x over 7 equals negative 1. Solve each individually, multiply both sides by 7. 7's cancel here. Leave me with x equals 1 times 7, 7. And negative 1 times 7 is a negative 7. We write from least to greatest, right, because that looks nicer. So our final answer is x equals negative 7 and a positive 7. And there we are. The absolute value of negative 9 plus v all over 8 equals 3. Okay? Well, my first step to isolate the absolute value is to multiply both sides by 8. That eliminates the 8's here, leave me with a negative 9 plus v in the absolute value equals 3 times 8, which is 24. From there, I can break this apart into two equations, okay? Because the absolute value is already isolated, leaving me with negative 9 plus v equals a positive 24, and negative 9 plus v equals a negative 24. So from there, I solve each one individually, right? I have to add a 9 to both sides of the equation, leaving me with v equals 24 plus 9, which is 33. And here I add a 9 to both sides as well, leaving me with v equals, and this one's tricky, okay, negative 24 plus 9 is a negative 15. From there, we have our final answers of 33 and negative 15. I have to write it nice and neat. Negative first, we have v equals negative 15 and positive 33. Negative 10, absolute value of v plus 2, and the absolute value equals negative 70. Okay? So from there, right, negative 10, absolute value v plus 2 equals negative 70. There's multiplication going on right there from the negative 10 to the absolute value. I need to isolate the absolute value, so I'm going to divide both sides by negative 10. That leaves me with the absolute value of v plus 2 left, okay, on the left here. And negative 70 divided by negative 10 is a positive 7. Remember, a negative divided by a negative is a positive. So now we have the absolute value of v plus 2 equals 7. I can break this apart into two equations, okay, because the absolute value is isolated. So v plus 2 equals a positive 7, and v plus 2 is a negative 7. Okay, we break it apart to a positive and to a negative. Now we solve both equations individually. I subtracted 2 to both sides, and I can do that to both equations here. And so this left one leaves me with 7 minus 2, which is 5. And we have v equals here. Negative 7 minus 2 is a negative 9. We write this from least to greatest, right? And so that looks a little nicer. V equals negative 9 and a positive 5. And that is both of our answers. There's two answers here, negative 9 and positive 5. Okay?
Minute Math. When you need help, you use Minute Math. Minute Math. Minute Math. When you need help, you use Minute Math. MinuteMathTutor.com.